I'm going to start this video off by saying that I love MMOs, specifically MMORPGs. And I don't even think love is the right word to describe this because it was more like an obsession. I poured countless hours of my childhood into them. It's kind of embarrassing to admit, but I threw myself into the MMO genre with the kind of reckless abandon of somebody who genuinely believed that grinding for imaginary loot was somehow a noble substitute for developing real-world skills. And keep in mind, I played every single MMO available to me in the market. I'm talking about World of Warcraft, Echo of Souls, Aura, Kingdom, DC Universe Online. And I truly mean everything. If it had quest, gear, and an optional subscription, I was already in line. And if an MMO was actually free to play, I would squeeze every last bit of content out of it with the kind of ruthless efficiency usually reserved for tax fraud. So, needless to say, I was absolutely addicted. But as time went on, I discovered the true magnificence of single-player games and MOBAs like League of Legends. Soon after, MMOs became a fond yet fading echo of a simpler time. But recently, I felt the itch to dive back into the world of MMOs. Nostalgia knocked on my door, promising me grand adventures, epic battles, and camaraderie that only forms when you're screaming at a healer who thinks mana management is a suggestion. So I ran to my computer and downloaded a big juicy buffet of MMOs, Blade and Soul, Elder Scrolls Online, New World, and anything else that looked even vaguely familiar. But unfortunately, after downloading and playing all those MMOs, what I got wasn't a warm embrace of nostalgia, but more of a limp handshake for mediocrity. With no exaggeration, playing these games was so fucking boring that I had a full-on existential crisis. By the second hour, I wasn't just questioning why I downloaded these MMOs, I was questioning the very concept of fun. I truly couldn't believe it. There was no way these amazing games from my childhood could be this boring. So I went back and played other games I loved as a kid to see if they still held up. And unsurprisingly, yes, everything was still amazing. Saints Row 2, fantastic. Prototype, excellent. Need for Speed Hot Pursuit, still a masterpiece of a racing game. I just couldn't understand why it was only the MMOs that got so much worse. Then it hit me. They updated these games over the course of the past decade, and in doing so, they ruined each one individually, stripping away all the things that made them fun to begin with. So now you might be wondering, why in God's name would they do that? And honestly, I don't know. Maybe these massive companies run by soulless businessmen are also allergic to making money, and perhaps they saw the dangerous effects that MMOs had on their player base and decided to ruin them on purpose to save the next generation. I'm kidding, of course. These heartless bastards would sell their mothers for a few pennies if they could. So allow me to break down the reasons why I think MMOs have gotten so dog shit over the past few years. And we're gonna start off with combat, because most combat systems in MMOs are like a plain bowl of oatmeal. Not outright awful, but so utterly forgettable that you wondered why you bothered with them in the first place. Which is such a massive shame, because games like Blade and Soul, Guild Wars 2, and Terra already proved that MMO combat could be fun, thrilling, and fluid. But here's the thing, I don't mind a game having tab target combat or being less action focused. No. See, the real issue I have with these games is that they're all so mind-numbingly easy. The difficulty of these games is dialed down so low that it feels like the game is afraid that you might break a nail if given any sort of adversity whatsoever. Which really annoys me, because I just spent an hour painstakingly sculpting the ugliest, most hideous avatar imaginable. A goblin-faced abomination so grotesque it could make mirrors shatter and NPCs flee in sheer terror. This creature, who is clearly not one of God's favorites, was born to struggle. It was made to claw its way out of the mud and prove its worth against the impossible odds it faces. So imagine my disappointment when my very first encounter is a level 1 boar so pitiful it practically dies of shame before I even swing my weapon. All of this is to say, developers make the early leveling of these games absurdly easy. The leveling of these MMOs is all smooth sailing as you one-shot enemies that might as well be decorative scenery for all the challenge and engagement they bring. And I do understand the idea behind it is to fast-track the player to the end game where the real content is. But unfortunately, in my experience, this approach backfires spectacularly, because a new player is either going to get bored and quit before they reach this mythical endgame, or they will stick around and get lulled into a false sense of security by the game's forgiving nature. The player who sticks around will grow comfortable, even complacent with the lack of challenge, assuming the entire experience will remain a relaxing power trip. But you see, that's until that player reaches the endgame. Now they're expected to memorize complex rotations and rely on coordinated teamwork. And these are all skills that the game never bothered to teach them. This jarring shift doesn't just frustrate, it alienates players. It leaves them feeling unprepared, overwhelmed, and questioning why they invested all this time in the first place. It's as if the developers don't realize they've essentially created two different games. And the best example I have of this is Blade and Soul. And that's because, in my humble, personal, 100% correct opinion, this game has one of the best combat systems ever made. The combat is a blend of blocking, parrying, and dodging all coming together in a way that feels so fluid and natural, and it has the best action bar of any MMO I've played. Instead of overwhelming you with 30 plus abilities, it gives you a nice and simple action bar, but all of the abilities flow into other abilities. For instance, if you block an attack attack, the game will prompt you to press F to use an ability that's not currently on your action bar. It keeps the combat clean and dynamic without feeling restrictive. But now we get to the frustrating part about all of this, and that is the early game no longer gives players the chance to experience how great the combat really is. When the game first came out in the West, you had to learn the combat to progress through the story. It wasn't overly difficult, but it encouraged you to engage with the game's mechanics. But now, good lord, most of the enemies in the early game go down with just a couple of hits. There is absolutely zero incentives to block, parry, or even to explore any of the combos. It's just a watered down experience that doesn't do the combat system any justice whatsoever. And I tested this myself. I ran through the story for about 10 hours using nothing but the starter weapon, gear, and soul shields. I didn't upgrade anything, and I still didn't struggle not once throughout that entire experience, not even 1 inch, one minuscule bit of difficulty. And this applies to every up-to-date MMORPG or any new ones releasing. They all have the same issue with difficulty. And I know the obvious defense complacent players always use, the classic it gets better in the endgame. But here's the thing though, the early leveling of an MMO is the most important part of the game. That's the part that determines whether a new player sticks around long enough to even reach the endgame. But unfortunately, it's also the most neglected aspect of modern MMOs. And the absolute worst part is that even if you find an MMO you genuinely enjoy, convincing your friends to try it is gonna be an uphill battle. Do you know how hard it is convincing your friends to play Final Fantasy XIV when the early game could easily be mistaken for a good alternative for melatonin? And the answer is very difficult. I know because I've tried and failed several times. But now we have reached a point where we need to bring some sort of solution to the table. The easiest option is to just make the early sections of these games more challenging. Players don't need to be punished for every mistake, but gently nudging them with a firm hand towards learning the combat mechanics would be a good place to start. However, this approach mostly only applies to new MMORPGs still in development. But what about existing MMOs? And before anyone suggests it, the solution is not and will never be level boosters. They are a plague upon this beautiful world and should be exterminated with extreme prejudice. So for current MMOs, I think an optional debuff that players can select during character creation would be ideal. For example, a player could choose a mode where their character deals 20% less damage, takes 50% more damage, but earns increased rewards like extra currency or better loot from dungeons and world monsters. And it doesn't have to be exactly like that, but having a system where players can increase the difficulty for themselves while being rewarded for the extra effort would be truly incredible. And yes, I know balancing this kind of system could be an absolute nightmare, but that's part of the fun. MMOs, especially the popular ones, have become stale and stagnant. Introducing something like this could be a relatively simple way to inject some excitement and chaos into the gameplay without requiring a complete rework of the early game. And that's pretty much it for this video. This is only part 1 where I'm talking about the combat aspects of it. I have a part 2 planned where I go into the social features and like the world building issues MMOs have, as well as like their terrible stories. And that should be coming out like next week or a few weeks after that. Thank you so much for watching. And if you made it this far into the video, I would love if you could provide some feedback, anything I could improve on, anything to make the videos more interesting, or any points I might have missed on, anything that comes to mind. I would love to hear them.